I'm not kidding. That Three Gorges Dam was the basis of Chinese development. The United States basis for economic development was the Hoover Dam. Every country had an important economic issue that would transform the economy. So the Three Gorges Dam was the basis of industrialization in China because it produced electricity. It's one of the biggest dam in the world. And in that vein, I put it to you, Jesse, that if we say that our economic thinking is going to the United States and Europe and saying, okay, climate change is the issue of the 21st century, and it's an existential issue. Therefore, the Americans and Europeans have to give Africa a revolutionary amount of money so that we don't do industrialization, we don't do all these things that are needed to be done, so that we can save, the carbon monoxide doesn't go up into the air, and we can save the planet. The question is not whether we are sitting on a moral platform and that should be the way that we go, but will the Europeans and the Americans buy it? I put it to you, Jim, that they want to invest $1 trillion in reconstruction in Ukraine. And do you know what is the budget for climate change? 100 billion. So I think it's a moot point. If Mr. Ruto's economic policy will be for us to get a check so that we could use that check to do goods and services, infrastructure, and pay the old and the poor and try to balance this country's budget and have some kind of economic growth. Okay. I don't think that's an economic model. I really don't believe that. And I think that the values, the intellectual value of going to plead to the moral platform of Europe and the United States over climate change, I think is bizarre. Thirdly, I think that if the new model for aid to be given to Kenya is based on our moves, our moral cry over climate change, I think that we're in the wrong party. I think we need clear economic policies that produce the best social policy in the world. And that, my dear friend Jesse, is jobs, jobs, jobs.
That's interesting. You're poking holes into the economic policy. Perhaps a chance of rebuttal, Prof. But equally, I mean, we're speaking at a time where we're seeing the adverse effects of climate change. And it's not just in Kenya. You've seen the recent floods. The latest news from DR Congo shows that more than 400 people have now been confirmed dead due to flooding. I think it's in South Kivu. What do you make about this messaging, especially from Africa, around climate change? Because listening to President Ruto is telling them, I mean, we all need to work in this together. We're all experiencing the adverse effects. It's either we work together or perish together. We're coming to the table as partners.
Jesse, for the purpose of our audience, climate change is real. It's going to affect this world, and it's probably going to affect the African more. One, because we're not prepared. The continent of Africa has contributed the least in terms of climate change, the changes that are taking place. The North industrial countries have contributed the most to the damage that we are seeing. And therefore, Africa must not come to it and say we did not contribute that, and therefore we are not responsible. Secondly, we want growth, we want development, so we want to use our fossil stocks that we have, just the way you have done it. That is a futile argument that is not going to help us. What is happening, Jesse, this is now called public goods. Whatever's happened is a global issue, it is a regional issue, it is a national issue. The kind of discussion that Hasi just put forward is that we cannot go over this issue as Kenya. We need to look at the continent of Africa and the African institution. AU has to fundamentally look at the structure of it, the action that is coming out of it, much more different than it has been in the past. The East Africa community, which Kenya leads now, East and Central Africa community, is one element that is going to drive home what Kenya needs, what Uganda needs, what Congo needs, and all that. Here's an example. Kenya is a fine airline. We're very proud to get into it, to go to Netherlands and back and forth. But it's not profitable. Uganda is creating their own airline. Rwanda is creating their own airline. The only airline which is profitable in Africa is Ethiopia. Why are we each creating our own airline instead of having the East African airline where everybody is contributing so that we can have movement between countries and out of the countries so we can deal with the rest of the world collectively? Here's opportunity for us, JC. America, after the Second World War, was able to revive Germany. First destroy it and then revive it to be where it is right now. America relationship is what has changed Japan to what Japan moved to the second largest economy in the world. Now it's number 3 largest economy in the world. America relationship is the one that has changed South Korea to become top 10 economy in the world. And all others, Taiwan, everything. So we want a different relationship with America. Substantial relationship which change the mindset of American investors, American consumer, about the quality of product produced in Africa. Just like China played a very crafty role, Jesse, lure America into investing heavily in China, such that almost any manufacturing that is done in China. It's cheaper, it's fast, it's quality. We can do the same thing in Africa, but Kenya cannot do it alone. We have to work with Tanzania, we have to work with Uganda, we have to work with Rwanda. That is the only way we can have the maximum benefit. So when it comes to cost of climate change, we can collectively say, here's our contribution. We're going to work toward zero pollution. But we also need to develop, we need to industrialize. And we need you to come in the middle so that we can work together. That's the relationship we need to have with China. That's what we need to have with the US, with Europe. Because Europe is coming. They're coming from all kinds because they need us. And without making a mistake to have Wagner type of group to come in to exploit even more, we have to have the structure collectively continental, East African, Southern African, West Africa, and North Africa. That is the only way we are going to be able to manage this global issue.
Okay, interesting. So, Daktari, finally on climate change, I mean, there's a lot to talk about, but if we could encompass it perhaps into how this Western countries, these developed countries can actually leverage on Africa's potential around renewable energy in order to collaborate, as William Ruto mentioned. We're not victims as such. We have our resources where we need your expertise in one way or the other. Equally, talk about the economic policy we have right now in the region, briefly.
President Ruto has literally become Africa's chief spokesperson of the climate agenda at the global stage. There is no leader right now who is speaking very loudly about the impact of climate change and the need for to invest in the climate agenda as Ruto on the continent at this stage, arguably. And I think that is something positive. Remember, Kenya is the headquarters for United Nations Developmental Program, as well as Habitat. And to the extent that the president has taken on this personally, I think is something encouraging, and it should challenge all of us to try and support that. In fact, we should be having those more front page stories on that, you know, than some of the kitchen politics that we have to deal with. One thing you've raised about exploiting Africa's potential in renewable energy, Kenya is one of the top 10 countries, number one, when it comes to geothermal potential in the world, not just within the continent, in the world. So you can imagine the amount of potential we have with regard to geothermal. Second, wind power across the continent, massive. Today, the cost of electricity in Kenya is probably the highest in recorded history, at least as long as we can remember. And part of it had to do with, shortage of just, enough power. But part of it has to do with, frankly speaking, inefficiency and lack of diversification. I think we've been very, very slow in trying to push renewable energies. That makes us extremely vulnerable to the uncertainties of international energy markets. Like right now, what's happening in Ukraine, of course, affecting all of us. But we've allowed this vulnerability to persist to the extent that when such changes occur, then we're just cooked gooses. There's nothing we can do about it. And that is sad. And so I think once the president is done with his tours, abroad, one of the things that perhaps may need to be revisited is actually how we can be able to reduce the cost of energy in the medium term and long term by investing in renewables, so that some of the nations we are engaging today that have extreme capacity and extensive experience, many years in renewable energies, whether it's Japan, which uses, of course, mostly nuclear, but they've been funding our geothermal, power projects in this country, or Germany, where we can invest in extensively in wind power and stuff like that. How can they multiply that kind of investment, but also accelerate the production of electricity? That is going to go a long way in actually cutting down our cost of energy, because by not investing in alternative sources of energy and renewables and expanding our potential, our grid potential, what that is doing is making the cost of production and manufacturing very expensive. That is pushing away businesses. And in part, not only does it cut in the profits, it becomes actually unsustainable in the long run. So you're going to see businesses moving to our neighboring countries as opposed to us. And if you're Kenya, even just a simple business running a kiosk, making chips, you're going to realize, chances are, your cost of electricity moved from 20,000 to 30,000 just in the last 1 month. It's unsustainable. And so as we engage partners who have experience and capacity in developing renewables, I think it should be part of our push for climate agenda, even as we ask the global community to chip into it. Now, my final point, as a fairly respected country in the global south and to the continent, Kenya's voice is normally listened to. One of the things we need to push is to hold especially the biggest polluters to account, not to account on what they should do, but what they've already committed to doing. The Kyoto Protocol, we're still waiting for the money. The Paris Accords, we're still waiting for the money. How come these countries have not been able to actually provide that? So even if we start talking about any other protocol, but these ones have failed, we've barely scratched the surface, then we're not getting anywhere. So we should lead the global south, and we should lead the continent at this stage in actually demanding that we are the least polluters, but we're suffering the most out of the consequences of climate change.
Okay. Interesting. So we shouldn't go to the table as partners, or what exactly are you saying?
We are partners because we also have solutions on actually what needs to be done. But at the same time, in our partnership, only one of us is eating all the food in the fridge. and it's not us.
Okay, interesting. I think that point is definitely home. Allow us to take a short break. As we come back, we evaluate the peace process in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Apart from that, what exactly is happening in Somalia? Well, we'll find out right after the break. Stay with us.
KTN News. Get the whole story. Your Wealth in 90 Seconds, brought to you by Standard Chartered Priority Banking. Have you locked your investments with little flexibility to do more?
I'm Paul Njoki, Head of Affluent Banking and Wealth Management, Kenya and East Africa. At a point in time, you will need cash flows to solve for a personal need or to invest and achieve higher return out of your portfolio. At Standard Chartered Priority Banking, we have the expertise to help you unlock the value of your portfolio by lending up to 70% in various currencies, including the US dollars, pounds, euros, and of course the Kenya shillings. My team of relationship managers, investment advisors, and insurance advisors are here to serve you, to help you achieve your life goals. Welcome to Priority Banking today.
Join Standard Chartered Priority Banking today. Email prioritybanking.ke@sc.com. Wealth expertise made to matter.
Kulingana vile hiyo insurance ya NHIF imenisaidia, ningeomba watu wengine ule ambaye hajaingia kwenye hiyo insurance awe mmoja wayo, sababu inasimamia pesa mingi sana, ile ambayo huwezi afford ukiwa unalipa cash.
Hi Wycliffe.
Yes, hello.
So unajua leo ndo mkoko unalika maua kakangu.
Nafikiri nitakuwa nimefika hapo, kwa hivyo
tupatane ndani ya Radio Maisha kama kawaida. So unajua tu. Anajulikana kama Chike, wimbo ni Roju. Hii ni Radio Maisha, tuko mbele pamoja. Mimi ni Nzula Makosi.
Awali ya yote uweze kujua kwamba safari hii ni bora zaidi ndani ya Maisha jioni. Kila siku ya wiki, Jumatatu ni siku ya Ijumaa, 9 mpaka saa 1. Tunaupiga mwingi sana mwana. Mimi naitwa Wycliffe Kumo.
Most of the viewers knows you as a gospel artist.
Wasudina jificha kisana mana nikwe mbali na visa mi
2023 I am taking over. Kindly introduce yourself and give us your story.
Angela Monani Musioka.
Lawrence Nyaga Njue.
Naitwa Justina Siokao.
Welcome to our today's episode.
My full story, full.
I formed a very strong drinking company.
I became blind 2008.
When I was in that bed, I felt the numbness.
Sharon alikuwa mtoto wa aina gani?
Sina mtu wa kunitetea. Hata nikiongea ukweli.
Sasa ndio nilionanga mwili nikaona kumbe mama alipasa.
It was so painful for me to see myself in the streets of Nairobi after being married.
For full story, stay tuned.
KTN News. Get the whole story.
Welcome back and thank you for staying with us. You're watching Morning Prime. We've just entered the last hour of the show. But definitely, you know what they say, sometimes you save the best for last. So in case you're just joining us, you're right on time. We continue evaluating the top stories from the country and the continent. Right before the break, we're taking a look at the climate change message that has been echoed by President William Ruto, even as he continues with his trip abroad. Apart from that, we just want to shift focus right now to the Kenya-Somalia relations just briefly, even as we shift focus to matters touching on DRC. Just over the weekend, I think President or former President Uhuru Kenyatta and the current Prime Cabinet Secretary Musalia Mudavadi met during a regional summit touching on the state of security in DRC. Remember, the elections are fast approaching and we'll definitely try and dissect anything you need to know on that particular matter. I'm still joined by my panelists. Just to reintroduce them to you: Ahmed Hashi, governance expert; Professor Noah Midamba, foreign policy expert; and we have Dr. Hassan Hanenje, who is a director at the Horn Institute. So let's start with Somalia just briefly, and to paint a context for our viewers, I mean, a lot has been happening, even as we focus on the president in Somalia, who is actually closing in on his 12 months in office, this being his second term as the leader right there, first elected in 2012 before recapturing the seat last year in a crowded presidential race. Of course, we'll try and evaluate Kenya's Somalia relations, but equally the role of foreign soldiers outside the African Union Transition Mission in Somalia, all to do with the fight against Al-Shabaab, and perhaps the contributions of the United Arab Emirates in revolutionizing Somalia's democracy.
There's a saying over there in Mogadishu. You know, they're watching us right now, and we're big in Mogadishu. So there's a saying there that says, Gabad Barate Anzelotti Adi Meiso Adi Yabal, which let me translate it. So this simply means that, you know, that the lady who lives around Mudaiga, Anzelotti is there, Mudaiga, Adi Meiso Adi Yabal, which is going to like a rural area. And I think this saying encapsulates the entire philosophy of Mr. Hassan Sheikh, who whose second term, whose first term as president was a disaster, and this term is turning out to be worse than his first term. In my view, there are just three things that we need to judge Mr. Hassan Sheikh. Well, what's his relationship with the region? Well, the relationship with Hassan Sheikh and the region is in the pits. He went to Uganda the other day under the auspices of Yoweri Museveni, who is very nice to the Somalis because they're cousins, their uncles are related to the Somalis. So he's always very gracious to them, always trying to help them. And, you know, our president, I hear, gave a lecture in that room, in which he berated some of the policies, if I may call it that, and the characterizations that have been going on in Somalia in the last few years. That's the first thing. Second is, which is more important, is his internal relationship. You know, the Somali people, under the banner of a group of people called Ma'awis Layal, these are patriots who stood up and shot and chased the Al-Shabaab all the way to Mogadishu from the middle provinces. Somalia has about 20,000 troops that are well trained. One group is called Harima'ad, which means cheetah, and the other one is called Gorgor, which means eagle. And I have not seen those troops join the fight next to the people of Somalia in a way that has chutzpah, in a way that punches a hole in the infrastructure of Al-Shabaab. So I think that Mr. Hassan Sheikh's reticence in taking on the Shabaab in a really robust way is something that we ought to criticize and criticize directly. So that's one. I think that he has made speeches about how he's going to attack them ideologically and how he's going to deal with the financial structures of the Al-Shabaab. I haven't seen anything yet. It's very important at the cultural level and the ideological level for the Somali people to attack Al-Shabaab's doctrine about Islam, because that is where it, Al-Shabaab is a racket group. It's like the Al Capone in Chicago. But it's got a banner of religion. But underneath it, it's a racketeering game. Yeah, they extort money from people and they create these bombings, which are essentially an art form of international spy agencies from the world in Somalia.
Okay.
The third thing is whether Mr. Hassan Sheikh is on the road to reconciliation. The agenda file on Somaliland, there's a guy called Colonel Musa in Hargeisa who attacked a small town called Las Anod and is causing bedlam in a country, in a region that has been stable, that was building its institutions and trying to stand on its own 2 feet. President Hassan Sheikh has been mum about that. He's the president of Somalia, he should be speaking about that. In Mogadishu itself, Mr. Sheikh, Hassan Sheikh has been appointing his family. He's appointing his clansmen and his family to the posts of government.
Right.
And, that is a faux pas. He should be looking towards the grand ideas of reconciliation, the grand idea of fighting Al-Shabaab, the grand idea of making sure the international community and the security systems in the region are trying to help us, to help Somalia. Lastly, and not leastly, is that the question is whether or not foreign military intervention in Somalia has failed or not. It's been nearly 20 years. Is this like Noam Chomsky's manufacturing consent? Is the intervention in there just to pay soldiers, to continue making Somalia a victim, and to continue perpetrating an intervention that has mission creep as its substance? Our learned senior on the right is always telling us about the strategy of an exit, which was made famous by the General Colin Powell. We don't know what the exit strategy is there. We hear that there's now ATMIS, and another of our experts will tell us about that. And I think that on these three main structures of how the administration will be judged, 12 months, I think I'd give him a D+. Also, he's appointed a prime minister who doesn't speak. So Mr. Sheikh is creating an imperial presidency. He does not want anyone else to speak. He's the foreign minister, he's the prime minister, he's the minister of finance, he's the speaker of parliament, he's the head of the military. And that is a recipe for failure. And I think that sooner or later that's going to cause trouble. Just yesterday, the prime minister said some obnoxious things about the state region of Puntland, in which he accused them of playing footsie over the issue of federalism. The president, regional president of Puntland, made some pathetic remarks about Las Anod. And the leader in Hargeisa is a complete failure. So the political class in Somalia is not helping anyone. President Ruto was right in criticizing them. I agreed with him 100%. I criticized President Ruto for saying there's no government in Somalia, which I think he should not have said at all. But he was right that the politicians in Somalia, the MCAs in Kenya are better. So if you put all these things in a capsule, I think that when Hassan Sheikh is going to be coming here to Nairobi, I think next week or in 10 days' time, And I think President Ruto should have a really frank discussion with the president of Somalia, because, you know, our boys are dying over there, Jesse. They're dying. We bury them every day here. And we don't want to tell the public about our soldiers. We're paying a massive price in Somalia. And President Ruto has to get this policy right. We have to really reassess what's happening there. You know that fellow there in Kismayo, you know about our policy there, the buffer policy. It's failed, completely failed. And he was here looking for support, he didn't get it. He went to Addis Ababa, he didn't get it, called Abdi Madobe. So all in all, I argue, and I argue vociferously, that there has to be some kind of transformational thinking, change in the policy towards Somalia in the short, medium, and long term.
Okay, Prof, briefly.
Yes, several elements that make the situation very complex, but it's something we cannot run away from. Number one is Somalia is part of the East African zone, the Horn of Africa, and the whole. So we have to do everything to move toward folding in Somalia as part of the East Africa community, such that the discussion then come to the East Africa framework. It got AU, African solution to deal with. Secondly, there is a lot of interest coming in, like I say, with the most beautiful lady at the center. Russia is interested, Turkey is interested, the Middle Eastern are interested, America is interested, China is interested to come in. Several reasons. One, the resources of the shores of the continent of Africa in front of Somalia, Kenya, all the way to southern parts of Africa, are very critical to those people who are coming. And unless we put a strong institution together that's going to deal with this outside interest, then we are going to continue to deal with really a lot of problems. And that's the reason Al-Shabaab has benefited, because they function well in chaos, when there's chaos. So I said the Somali must be treated as part of us, because when you look at the kind of businesses that's going on between Mogadishu and Nairobi and everywhere, there is easily coming up one of the largest malls in East and Central Africa. Who is building? How did they come around? So relationship between Kenya and Somalia is interwoven completely. That's my number one. Number two, the leaders are going to come and go. Since Siad Barre, there's never been stability in this area. We all know the reason why. We have to be able to work with the current president to stabilize the situation, and not necessarily criticize him, but be able to give him the best that we can, militarily, for security reasons, economically, for to stabilize the country, so that we can deal with this issue as an African situation, given the current world interest and potential, huge potential for us, potential problem in the future. Both economically, it will benefit if we stabilize the situation. Politically, it will become worse. It will unstable the East Africa, Tanzania, Uganda, Kenya, and therefore it is important for us to work very, very close with them. There is a case that exists that has not been solved between Somalia and Kenya. We need to be able to sit around the table like what we are here the president of Kenya, the president of Somalia, and the East Africa community and said, this is our situation, we solve it, okay, on how this parallel line, the offshore, will work in the future. So that issue need to be closed.
Okay. And speak to us about ATMIS, because you mentioned about the efficiency of ATMIS and your take on how central it is in terms of protecting the hard-won gains in Somalia, briefly.
Give it to Kenenja.
Yes.
Uh-huh.
I think, part of what I'm going to say will differ just slightly from Hashi, especially insofar as efforts against Al-Shabaab are concerned. I firmly believe that Hassan Sheikh Mohamud's government has made some progress, especially certain gains on the battlefield against Al-Shabaab because, it's evident Al-Shabaab has been pushed out of some important areas. And what a lot of us have been saying is there has to be now a formula and a strategy to secure that kind of progress, or else tomorrow you're still going to find Al-Shabaab, just getting back to those areas. So it's going to be very helpful. Now, ATMIS' mission is scheduled to come to an end, this coming year. But what is important, you asked a question. ATMIS' mandate is different from AMISOM. Okay. Right now, they are supporting the Somali army, the Somali government, the Somali institutions to build them technical capacity and stuff like that. Their objective is not to go out to do what they were doing as AMISOM. And you remember also that time also exposed them to lots of dangers. And, hundreds of them were literally slaughtered and stuff like that. And Kenya has paid dearly in blood and treasure, in that process. But we have a challenge, even as ATMIS' mission comes to an end. Is Mogadishu ready for exit? When we're talking about exit strategy, exit from what? Exit from what? You see, there are many countries out there. The United States, for instance, could exit from Afghanistan. The shores of the U.S. are very far away from the Pashtuns in Afghanistan. We are not. Okay, we are not. If there is a country that has suffered greatly as a result of the collapse of Somalia, outside Somalia, is Kenya. It's still a country. It's not just from us hosting refugees, but the continuing problem of insecurity and terrorism. Okay. Is directly attributed to the collapse of the state of Somalia. Now, two, we are the only country in the world that Somali dynamics in Somalia affect our own politics here, and vice versa. It doesn't do that much in Ethiopia, even though they have a whole state, with Jigjiga, he knows. Doesn't. No other country. It's Kenya. And so, for us somehow to pretend we can leave Somalia alone, okay, and somehow let them figure out their things, no. Their problems are our problems. We need to understand that very clearly, and Kenyans need to know that. We are so intertwined and so intricately connected that if things go bad there, they're going to go bad here for us. Which is why I like that the president has been very active in, trying to be very assertive, but also trying to give Somalia hope of actually joining the East African community. Because despite the challenges, Somalia is one of the most natural countries to be part of the East African community. Not to mention, they're only part of the 4 countries that uses the shilling, like all of us. But it's more natural, the way we are connected. It is so connected to Kenya. One thing that we need to do at the time when the world seems to be focusing on Kyiv, especially the global north, is as Africans, what can we be able to do within our own resources to support efforts, not just securing the country against terror, but also building institutions so that, for instance, You can prevent the rise of potential personal rule that Hash is complaining about. The kind of clinicization of politics that has been very harmful to Somalia, but also to ensure that the parties in there, because some parties, while HSM is very forward thinking in certain perspectives, terms of regional dynamics, that what's part of the EAC, there are politicians there who probably don't want to be part of the EAC because it will not serve their interests. How can we be able to ensure that we're actually moving the same boat and we organize a regional framework, not just us, to have that common understanding? But to the extent we expect our government to give us an exit strategy is actually being naive. It's almost like, well, we build this house together, you are on first floor, I'm on second floor, and you tell one of them to move, and leave me there. You can't. And so, to the extent that we're so intricately connected, their problems are going to be our problems, and the coming visit of the Somali president, I think, number one, provides an opportunity for us to have, number one, honest discussions, exchange, but also try to build. Remember, during the last visit, the former president, Uhuru Kenyatta, Kenya was able to enter into some kind of arrangements with Somalia with regard to opening up trade, visa, I think, issues, to be removed because they prevented business from taking place, aviation and stuff like that. We need to put in place framework to ensure that we actually now open up the two countries to be able to start doing business, to have our citizens move between, each other's countries. Because let's be honest, if you make it harder for a Somali business person to come to Kenya, they're going to have to go elsewhere. Number two, diplomatically, if everybody has to apply for a visa and go through the hoops, then they're going to prefer doing that in another capital apart from Nairobi. There is no reason why, for instance, of course, we had our differences, for instance, with Mogadishu for some time, but countries in the region, we should not be having visas. You see, it has worked perfectly well. When we go to Uganda, when you go to Ethiopia, you don't need them. Why do we need visas to go to Mogadishu and vice versa? So I think these are some of the issues that we need to sit and talk about, as well as enhanced regional approach towards countering Al-Shabaab and securing the territories and the regions that have actually been liberated by HSM's government supported by ATMIS as well as other international partners.
Okay, well noted. And let's just briefly shift focus to Mati, Sudan, because it's still within the region. And I remember having the discussion with the two gentlemen right here last week, emphasizing on how critical it would be for, the African Union to sort of roll in and mediate on the ongoing conflicts we saw in Sudan. Just to bring our viewers up to date, more than 700,000 have been displaced in Sudan. That number, of course, is rising ever since violence erupted in April 15th. It's almost a month thereabout. But sort of progress, talks are ongoing in Jeddah between the envoys of the warring factions to end the bloodshed. And unfortunately, as the peace talks are ongoing, the violence is still ongoing in Sudan. Definitely bringing to the fore various humanitarian issues like safe passage and whatnot. Daktari, I'd like your take on the conflict in Sudan. Of course, the negotiating table has already been approached. The talks are ongoing, but are we treating the symptoms right here? Are we dealing with the disease, the cause of this whole eruption? And interestingly, I saw an article, perhaps hinting at defunding these warlords, that might be the nail on the head, the final nail on the coffin in terms of bringing these two warring factions to cease. What say you about what we've seen in Sudan?
The talks are ongoing.
Yeah.
I'm not so sure about that. I think there are talks about the talks going on. Okay.
Yeah.
And the reason is you're having multiple players pretending to be mediating or facilitating talks between parties. And lack of united approach means there's really no talks really going on that are substantive. because it always has to happen within. You cannot have Juba saying they're doing that, Turkey saying they want to do or they're doing that, Riyadh, Saudi Arabia saying they're actually trying to do that. What you're doing, it's not possible in diplomacy. It does not work like that. And that is why it was very, very important that we actually have a regional approach that is endorsed by the African Union. So we know who is, for instance, the mediator or the go-between, the same way it was in Tigray. We knew it was Uhuru Kenyatta, supported by AU as well as the international community, or the Nairobi process on DRC Congo, or the Luanda process, before that. It's very clear on who is doing what. Right now, it's not. Second, defunding. Who will be defunding it? Without a mechanism, anytime you're intervening in a conflict of that magnitude, you need a mechanism with carrots and sticks that is united. So, defunding, those are part of sanctions. Who is going to sanction? And who will you be sanctioning? Remember, both the military as well as RSF, they have their benefactors. They have their masters who are funding them. We've been aiding them all this while. Yeah. They have an interest on their part winning. Now, unfortunately, those funders or those supporters, external supporters, they're not exactly keen on regional mechanisms being successful, because that is going to push them out. And that is why you see competition to try and solve that from different parties. But because as Africans and as the region, we have not stood out, number one, to say we are the ones who are going to do it. Number two, you're going to have to come through us, But and also you diplomatically see how we can ensure that there is unanimity with regard to the approach. You can't defund them. There's nothing going to do, about them. And the parties right now in Sudan, they don't have an incentive to stop fighting, because each of them calculates that they're likely to make progress, thereby strengthening their hand at a negotiating table, ultimately, if the table is ever going to be there.
I predicted this issue. I'll give it to my senior in a minute. I predicted this issue here on this show and said that there's a huge conflict is on the horizon for the Sudans. I believe the next one is going to be in South Sudan. And that is going to be because of the transition of Salva Kiir. There is no transition in the constitution. There's no transition anyway. It's not possible to have elections in South Sudan. It's not possible to have these political parties. South Sudan is in this political quagmire. And sooner or later that is going to explode into different parts. We don't want that to happen. But my sense of the political economy of South Sudan tells me that it was more unstable than the Sudan. I also predicted that there was going to be major fallout and failed states across the Sahel. It's already beginning to show in Chad and Mali. And I think that we ought to wake up in this continent, transform the African Union, get our military response highly mechanized with everything that it needs, and most importantly is the crisis of the nation state in Africa needs three things. We need to integrate our economies, we need to add value to our products, agriculture and minerals. We need to trade among each other and produce jobs for nearly 1 billion young people on this continent. And we cannot do it through a dictatorship. If you try to go down the road of the dictatorship, Libya will happen to you. The Arab Spring will happen to you. 2007 will happen to you here. I think that we are being exposed to the very real forces of history that are confronting Africa. And unless the political leadership start thinking in a very radical way about how to defend us from the vagaries of the international system, which I've repeatedly talked about on this show, I think that it is going to be a hard mile for us. And I put it to you, Rogers, that President Ruto is keen to take up this mantle of being a regional leader and to try and influence events in our continent. It starts with the African Union. It starts with a sober assessment of where we ought to go. And if we do those things, we create that roadmap, we will not have Somalias in this continent. There's no reason to have Somalia to be a failed state. One of the richest nations in Africa. It's got look at its coastline, look at its resources, look at its people, the entrepreneurship they're having here in its league.
All right.
So there's no reason for them to fail. They're failing because they don't have political leadership.
Jesse, again, global context. We are right back to the Cold War. The only time is that there are multiple factors that are involving this Cold War. You have the Russians, the Chinese, the Americans. Now you have the Middle East and you have the Turkeys. Everybody wants a hand. Sudan is one of the richest when you talk about resources. Then there is this port of Sudan, which is a critical strategic place. And the former president basically negotiated with the Russians to come and take, have it as a port of call. That's not going to go well with the Americans and Europeans. So there is a force to reckon with from outside, with resources. And there is this Africans leadership which is absent. How in the world did you take an African issue from the continent of Africa to Saudi Arabia? What are you exactly what you're going to solve? So the issue needs to return back to Addis Ababa. You need to return for very serious discussion with these two warlords and get a sense of what is it, because the setup was done by the former president. Basically, this were his troops that he created, to guard him, and everything. And so now they've reached a point, what my colleagues here are saying, that each side think they will win. It doesn't matter how many people they kill, but they will win. And Africans need to be on that table, the round table. Africa need to lead the round table. Need to create incentive for the Russians to come in and support what we're doing. Incentive for Americans to come in. And if Saudis want support, give us the resources in order to help these two people come to a point. But one time or another, you cannot do away with one and expect the other one to function. That is the thorny pot. Who is going to become, the leadership? How do we move from military to a civilian leadership?
Well, interesting questions. We have to talk about DRC, but briefly, Hashi. Yeah.
Why is it that Africans from the Sudan, probably the most ancient society in our continent, going to Saudi Arabia to talk peace? Why?
Only God knows.
I think right there is the problem of culture.
Okay.
The great Anta Diop, Allah yarham, the physicist from Senegal, taught us that unless we change this mindset and return back to our own sources of ingenuity, we're not going to solve the problems that are ahead of us or with us. Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are part of the problem of the Sudan. It is confusion was confounded for these two generals to go to the same place where the conflict was manufactured. It is important for the public intellectual to speak in a way that points to the truth. Because if we don't point these things out, I put it to you, Rogers, is that the very idea of Africa as a living part of this global system that we have is not going to be part of the discourse that we want to have. So at the end of the day, I think we ought to oppose Arab intervention in East Africa and in the Horn. We ought to oppose it. We ought to oppose it very strongly. Okay. And we ought to support very strongly the IGAD and the African Union. We ought to really support these solutions that are cooked inside our own kitchens. And if we don't do that, what is going to happen is that they're going to impose solutions from the United Arab Emirates and from Jeddah. And that is going to take the personality of our continent out of the discussion.
Interesting. Well, we'll continue monitoring what has been described as the talks before the talks. Definitely hoping for a lasting solution to that crisis in Sudan. Gentlemen, let's shift focus to DRC real quick and first. And it was an interesting weekend during the 11th high-level summit of the Regional Oversight Mechanism of the Peace, Security and Cooperation Framework for the heads of state and government that was held in Burundi, specifically Bujumbura. Former President Uhuru Kenyatta definitely playing a key role in the peace process right there. And let's just hear some of the sentiments that were shared during that particular summit meeting, even as the objective of the summit is centered at evaluating the security situation right there. Listen in.
Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, the moment I give my colleague, His Excellency Ndayishimiye, who is the President of Burundi, when I give him the powers of the realm, I know that there is a lot going on when it comes to security in the Great Lakes region, especially in the Congo. Actually, for the last weeks, the people of Congo have been victims of deaths in Kishishe, in Ruchuru, in the province of North Kivu, given activism of terrorist groups that are really causing havoc in the region. In the same vein, there is a raise in tensions observed in Sudan, in Khartoum, and this brings about innocent victims and many displaced persons.
The United Nations remains fully engaged by your side. Only together can we achieve the common objectives of peace, security and cooperation of the Addis Ababa framework. The peoples of the region are counting on us. I thank you. Asante sana. Murakoze Shane.
Okay, DRC President Felix Tshisekedi as well as Antonio Guterres in that particular meeting. We've just heard from them. So briefly, gentlemen, because a lot has been said about the DRC peace process. And I remember last week, Professor actually outlined the situation in DRC and what was expected in terms of the mandate of that regional force. So, Dr. Hanenje, I mean, we have elections approaching in DRC, and do you believe that mandate was misinterpreted in one way or the other by the political class in the Democratic Republic of Congo as the nation gears for those elections? Because why is KDF sort of being blamed for the situation in eastern DRC from where you sit?
We've seen a number of things, take place in the DRC in the last, few months. And one of those is the sentiment is emerging in Eastern DRC against the Kenyan contingent and the East African ICRAF. And it has to do with, I think, the expectation that ICRAF was supposed to go and engage M23. Now, to be fair, ICRAF, they've managed to actually have M23 move away from the areas that they were supposed to move away from to the areas of cantonment, and the ceasefire thus far has lasted, I think, for several weeks, ever since those efforts. And so to actually say that nothing has been done, I think is going to be dishonest. But politically, I think they desire to see any intervening force engage M23 from Kinshasa is extremely high. Now, if the Kenyan or the East African, regional force starts engaging M23, they become party to the conflict directly, in part because you're taking a side. Number two, there are more than 100 or 120 militia groups in Eastern DRC.
Wow.
Yes. And M23 is just one. It's a big one because allegedly it's backed by a state actor, but there are more than 100 of those.
That's so crazy.
So how do you address that larger question? And that is why the Nairobi process was also meant to address that larger question of these problems. But we understand, and I think Nairobi understands, and the region, that this is as much as a local problem as it is a regional problem. You have disagreements between DRC and Congo, especially over the alleged, number one, support of M23 by Rwanda on one hand, but then alleged support of subversive elements in DRC who are targeting Rwanda.
Okay.
Now, DRC has a history of having harbored the Interahamwe militias who are responsible for genocide. That's a fact. Part of Kagame's involvement in DRC, in support of Kabila, was actually to try and destroy those camps. That number one, were holding 2 million Rwandese refugees, as well as the Interahamwe militia.
Okay.
But then, without solving that regional question, if Kenya or ICRA, for instance, because Kenya is leading this mission, were to get involved in combat, then it's going to go actually outside the mandate. Number two, recently, a few days ago, the SADC announced they're going to deploy, in the Eastern DRC. Now, of course, that's also going to complicate the problem if the forces in East Africa and Southern Africa are going to work together. Remember, Tanzania, Malawi, and South Africa are already involved in DRC as part of MONUSCO for years. Still, they haven't actually brought the kind of required result. So, in summary, this intervention has to be followed closely by the political process, because that is what is going to ensure long-lasting peace and perhaps allow for elections to take place in December, if it's going to happen.
Just briefly, let's start with Prof.
Jesse,
Briefly,
the solution is political solution. It's not the gun. General Nyaga is one of the most finest military leader that this country has ever produced. He follows his mandate very clearly. Like I said last time, the expectation on behalf of Sekedi is that they're going to go in and shoot. We have a complex international involvement from any country you can choose. They're there. They're funding. They have their own militia. They are extracting. And we know the reason why they are there. So the East Africa community, which Congo is now part, the AU, IGAD, and everybody must insist that international community move out.
All right.
And then we need to go in with the issue of what do you do about M23 and all those people that have been in that country for a long time. Should they be incorporated into the greater military of Congo? DRC need a robust military security. And then they need institutional building so that this area is, there's no non-functioning institution. When you do all those together, and this is where African leadership come in, they need to step forward, they need to focus, because our bread basket and the future of Africa is right here in this country.
V.S. Naipaul, in his novel Bend in the River, said that as a people they were isolated, they were wrapped in their isolation, the Congo, people of Congo, if I remember it correctly. I think that I think that's a kind of controversy that is raised in non-fiction and fiction about Congo. They're no more. I think they're the most non-isolated country in the world. You can see the history of the Belgians. You can see the history of Tipo Tip. Remember Tipo Tip? To slave around there. You could see the history of Lumumba. You could see the history of Mobutu Sese Seko. You could see the history of the invasion of Zaire. You can see the change of name. It's got, history has three parts. One that moves fast, one that moves slowly, and one that doesn't move at all. The one in Congo is moving very fast. And without regional, as my learned friend on the right and left have said, without intervention from our neighbors, but in a very positive way, the DRC the tips might balance off the scale and it might fall off, just as Somalia did. So there is a responsibility that we in Kenya have. It's a huge responsibility. We have to look at Somalia, we have to look at South Sudan, we have to pay attention to Ethiopia, we have to pay attention to all these countries, and then we get accused of being, a kind of self-absorbed country. We're not. We have just as much problems as anybody else in this region. But we have decided to eat our ugali and sleep it over and talk about it in the morning.
All right.
That's the difference between us and those folks.
Okay.
So we urge for peace in the DRC, and we urge for peace now in the DRC.
Well, gentlemen, I think it has been a fruitful discussion. Thank you so much for your time and your input, or is it submissions right here? We definitely value your input.
We didn't have closing words.
Well, our time is... sorry, I took that away from you.
That's all right.
Apologies for that, but we have bills to pay, as they usually say. So, Dr. Hassan Hanenje, asante sana for your time. Ahmed Hashi, always a pleasure. And Prof. Midamba, asante sana for coming right here. Thank you so much for watching Morning Prime. I hope you've adequately informed on the latest news making headlines. My name is Jesse Rogers. Enjoy the rest of your viewing. Good morning.
Great job, Roger.